Nobody expected this to happen the way it did. Not this fast, not this directly, and definitely not with this level of consequences. For years, Venezuela's oil industry has been treated like a shadow of its former self, crippled by sanctions, internal collapse, and global isolation. But now, in a move that caught Washington completely off guard, Venezuela has effectively blocked U.S.-linked oil exports, sending shockwaves through energy markets and raising a far more serious question than oil prices alone. This isn't just about barrels and tankers anymore. This is about power, retaliation, and a message that was meant to be heard loud and clear in the United States. To understand why this matters so much, you have to understand the timing. Over the past year, the U.S. quietly loosened certain restrictions on Venezuelan oil, allowing limited exports and financial flows under tightly controlled licenses. Officially, this was framed as a pragmatic move to stabilize global oil markets. Unofficially, it was a test of whether Venezuela would play by new rules, whether political pressure could be eased without losing leverage, and whether energy security could be managed without escalation. What happened instead has completely rewritten that calculation. Reports now indicate that Venezuela has moved to block oil shipments linked to U.S. interests, targeting specific export routes, contracts, and intermediaries. This wasn't announced with a dramatic speech or a formal declaration. It didn't need to be. The message was delivered through action. Tankers delayed, contracts frozen, payments disputed, access restricted. Each move calculated, each step deliberate, and each signal unmistakable. This was not an accident. It was a decision. What makes this even more serious is how targeted the action appears to be. Venezuela is not shutting down all oil exports. It is not cutting off every foreign buyer. Instead, the pressure is being applied selectively, focusing on U.S.-linked flows and partners. That distinction matters. It tells us this isn't desperation. This is leverage. And leverage is only used when a country believes it has options. For the U.S., the implications are uncomfortable. While Venezuela is no longer a dominant supplier of American oil imports, its crude still matters, especially for certain refineries along the Gulf Coast that are specifically configured to handle heavy crude. When those flows are disrupted, replacement is not instant. Costs rise, logistics get complicated, margins shrink, and those pressures don't stay inside refineries. They ripple outward, into fuel prices, into supply chains, and into political conversations that Washington would rather avoid. But oil is only the surface layer of this story. Beneath it lies a much deeper geopolitical shift. Venezuela's move comes at a moment when global energy alliances are already under stress. Conflicts in multiple regions have tightened supply. Shipping routes are increasingly vulnerable, and energy has once again become a strategic weapon rather than just a commodity. In that environment, even a country that was once dismissed as economically irrelevant can suddenly matter again. There is also the question of coordination. Venezuela does not operate in isolation. Its recent actions come as it strengthens ties with other powers that have their own reasons to challenge U.S. influence. Energy cooperation, financial alternatives, and diplomatic backing all play a role here. Blocking U.S.-linked oil exports is not just about immediate revenue. It's about positioning. It's about signaling alignment. And it's about demonstrating that pressure can flow in both directions. Inside Washington, this creates a dilemma. Respond too aggressively, and you risk escalating a confrontation that could destabilize already fragile markets. Respond too weakly, and you invite further challenges, not just from Venezuela, but from others watching closely. Every move now sets a precedent, and in geopolitics, precedents rarely stay contained. What makes this situation particularly volatile is that it's unfolding in layers. On the surface, officials will talk about technical disputes, licensing issues, and contractual disagreements. Behind closed doors, however, the conversation is far more serious. This is about whether economic pressure still works the way it used to. It's about whether sanctions still deter, or whether they've reached a point of diminishing returns. And it's about whether the U.S. can afford to treat energy security as a secondary issue in a world that is increasingly unstable. For Venezuela, this move carries risk. Blocking U.S.-linked exports could invite retaliation. It could complicate negotiations. It could even backfire economically if miscalculated. But the fact that Caracas proceeded anyway suggests confidence, or at least a willingness to absorb pain in exchange for long-term positioning. That alone should concern policymakers. As markets absorb the news, reactions are mixed. Prices fluctuate, analysts debate impact, politicians downplay significance. But beneath the noise, one thing is becoming clear. This is not a one-off event. It is part of a broader pattern where energy is once again being used as a geopolitical tool, and where even smaller players are willing to push back against larger powers. The question now isn't just what Venezuela has done, it's what comes next, and more importantly, how the United States responds without triggering consequences it cannot control. What makes Venezuela's decision even more unsettling is how it fits into a larger global pattern that has been forming quietly for years. Energy is no longer just about supply and demand. It has become a language of power, a way to negotiate without sitting at the same table, a way to apply pressure without firing a single shot. Venezuela understands this, and its latest move shows a level of strategic awareness that many underestimated. For decades, U.S. energy dominance was built on predictability, stable contracts, reliable shipping lanes, and the assumption that economic pressure would always flow in one direction. That assumption is now being tested. When Venezuela blocks U.S.-linked oil exports, it's not trying to collapse the American economy. That would be unrealistic. Instead, it's creating friction, just enough disruption to remind Washington that control is not absolute. This kind of friction has consequences beyond energy markets. It affects diplomatic leverage, it complicates negotiations, it forces policymakers to rethink timelines and priorities. And it does all of this while staying just below the threshold of open confrontation. That is what makes it effective. There is also a psychological component. By targeting U.S.-linked exports specifically, Venezuela is reframing the narrative. Instead of being the isolated sanctioned state reacting defensively, it positions itself as an actor capable of choosing when and how to apply pressure. That shift in perception matters, especially in international politics, where credibility often outweighs raw power. The U.S. response so far has been cautious, and for good reason. Any escalation risks pushing Venezuela closer to alternative partners who are more than willing to absorb its oil under different financial arrangements. The global energy market is fragmented enough that rerouting flows, while inefficient, is possible. That reduces Washington's leverage and increases Caracas's room to maneuver. Meanwhile, American refiners and energy companies are left navigating uncertainty. Contracts that once seemed stable now carry political risk. Insurance costs rise, legal disputes multiply, and long-term planning becomes harder. This doesn't trigger an immediate crisis, but it creates a slow, grinding pressure that accumulates over time. Domestic politics also play a role. Energy prices are never just numbers in the U.S. They translate directly into public sentiment. Even modest increases can become political liabilities. Venezuela knows this. It doesn't need to cause a spike. It only needs to contribute to volatility. In an election cycle or a tense economic environment, that volatility becomes leverage. Another factor is precedent. If Venezuela can selectively block U.S.-linked oil exports without facing immediate, overwhelming consequences, others may take note. The message would be clear. Strategic defiance is possible. Pressure is no longer a one-way street, and economic tools can be repurposed. This is why the situation demands careful analysis, not just reaction. Washington must weigh whether tightening pressure would actually achieve its goals or whether it would accelerate the very realignment it wants to prevent. In geopolitics, forcing choices often backfires when alternatives exist. For Venezuela, the calculus is complex but deliberate. It is balancing short-term economic costs against long-term strategic gains. It is testing boundaries, probing responses, and adjusting accordingly. This is not reckless behavior. It is calculated risk-taking. The broader lesson here is uncomfortable. The era where energy security could be treated as a technical issue is over. It is once again a core strategic concern, and decisions made now will echo far beyond the immediate headlines. As this standoff unfolds, one thing becomes increasingly clear. The real battle isn't just over oil. It's over influence, credibility, and the ability to shape outcomes in a world that is becoming more fragmented by the day. Looking ahead, the consequences of Venezuela's move will depend less on what has already happened and more on how the next steps are handled. This is where strategy matters most. Every signal, every statement, and every policy adjustment will be scrutinized, not just by Caracas and Washington, but by capitals around the world watching closely. There are several possible paths forward, and none of them are without risk. The United States could choose to respond by tightening restrictions, increasing pressure, and attempting to reassert control through economic means. That approach might satisfy domestic political demands, but it carries the risk of accelerating Venezuela's shift toward alternative partners and financial systems that bypass U.S. influence altogether. Another option is negotiation, quiet, technical discussions aimed at restoring limited oil flows while extracting political concessions. This would require patience and a willingness to accept imperfect outcomes. It would also require acknowledging that leverage is no longer absolute. That may be politically uncomfortable, but it could prevent escalation. There is also the possibility of inaction, allowing the situation to stabilize on its own, minimizing attention and avoiding dramatic responses. This approach banks on the idea that Venezuela's leverage is limited and that markets will adjust. But inaction carries its own risks, particularly if it is interpreted as weakness. For Venezuela, the challenge is sustaining pressure without overplaying its hand. Blocking U.S.-linked exports sends a message, but sustaining that position requires economic resilience and diplomatic backing. Miscalculate, and the costs could outweigh the gains. But if managed carefully, it could reposition Venezuela in ways that seemed impossible just a few years ago. What cannot be ignored is the signal this sends about the global order. Power is becoming more diffuse, influence is being contested in new ways, and tools that were once considered reliable are losing their effectiveness. Energy, once again, sits at the center of that transformation. For American audiences, this story matters not because Venezuela suddenly controls U.S. energy security, but because it highlights a shift that affects everyone. A shift toward a world where economic pressure is contested, where smaller players take calculated risks, and where stability can no longer be taken for granted. The situation remains fluid. Outcomes are not predetermined. But one thing is certain. The decision to block U.S.-linked oil exports has already achieved its first objective. It has forced attention. It has altered conversations. And it has reminded the world that in geopolitics, even moves that seem limited on the surface can carry far-reaching consequences. How this ends will depend on choices made in the coming weeks, choices that will shape not just oil markets, but the balance of power itself.